Hi everybody and welcome to the next ADAS lecture in the series City Lust with Charlie Koolhaas. So Charlie is an artist, photographer and writer, and she'll be joining us this week to speak about her new book City Lust. In the book, Charlie takes us to London, Guangzhou, Lagos, Dubai and Houston, and they're all cities that Charlie's lived in or worked. So after we hear from Charlie tonight, we'll open up for some questions and you can type these into the chat or into the Q&A function where myself and Charlie can both see them. So before I pass you on, I'd just like to say a little bit about ADAS. So we're a student-led society who aims to produce a range of lectures, workshops and social events to students and the wider architecture community. Although we can't be together in person this year, this hasn't stopped us, and we've already had people join us from all over the UK to speak or listen to our lectures. So tonight I'm excited to get back on with our programme on another excellent speaker and a very exciting topic. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Charlie.
Okay, hi everybody. I wish I could see you, but I see all your names. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my book, City Lust, which is, as Glenn said, it's a portrait of 5 different cities on different continents in the globe to create a kind of cross-section of the world. It's predominantly, or it was intended as a photography book, but then it became also a written story as a way, and it became a kind of personal, almost biographical story as a way of captioning the photographs. And maybe we can talk about this later in our conversation and discussion, but the story is really a way of dealing with the problem of how to caption photographs in a way that doesn't allow the text to kind of dominate the images. Anyway, so having said that, I'm going to hopefully click. How do I do that yet? So these are the 5 different cities that I went to. And I start in my birthplace, London, and I sort of premise it with my personal background. So I talk about growing up in London in the late 70s and in the 80s, which was a kind of very multicultural city. I was the child of foreigners, and a lot of my friends were also the children of foreigners. And so we lived in this, in a way we were living out the fantasy or the multicultural fantasy of the kind of hippie era to a certain extent. And I talk about living in West Hampstead, which was also filled with a lot of like hippie artists. And at the same time, it was rubbing against a kind of very harsh urban conditions of London in the 70s and 80s. So I talk about this kind of idealistic multiculturalism that was also met with a huge amount of tensions and problems. I went to a very open, liberal, kind of hippie primary school. But when I grew up, I went to a more brutal high school, which was, and when I entered that, it was at the moment that rave kind of was invented. And we started going to warehouses and raving to, like dancing, if you could call it that, to the kind of weird, repetitive sounds of rave music and electronic music. And I talk about this because in this strange, I talk about in these moments, we didn't know, and no one was to know that this would become a kind of movement or an art form that eventually would take over the world. And was really a product of the kind of digital era. So anyway, so we started in these kind of illegal raves that would eventually spurn DJ culture that would become, that would go travel everywhere. North London was also where there was a lot of reggae music, punk music. And it's funny because photography is a very silent art. And at the same time, cities are very loud. And I always found that in order to dissect a city, music is one of the really most important ways of understanding what the kind of cultural compositions of a city is. And its music tells you about who lives there. So in my story, I really tried to talk about music culture in a way to give, with writing, a kind of sound to the cities that I was photographing, but also to show how music culture would be one of the ways in which the kind of world would ultimately become connected. I tell the story of the People's Club, which is a Caribbean social club in Holloway. And I talk about how, and of course, reggae music, which started in Jamaica and was kind of broadcast through London in particular, eventually also kind of spread out through the world, so that now you can find like a reggae festival in, almost every country in the world. So what was interesting was that global culture was kind of born out of a lot of these smaller cultures that eventually were kind of appropriated. And so what I think the whole concept of cultural appropriation is a very interesting one and a very loaded one, because in a way, global culture is a kind of homogenization of lots of local cultures that have been kind of absorbed and have traveled. And I'm really interested in the way in which these local cultures travel and how they become global and how they become appropriated anew in every single place where they will reappear. And I think rave music is one of these examples. Hip hop is also an example. I myself became an artist when I left university. I started my studies in sociology, and then I became interested in photography, and I moved to London and started writing for magazines. And one of the magazines I worked for was a magazine called Tank, a fashion magazine, which was located in Soho. And Soho in London was the kind of epicenter of this kind of new creative class, it was called then, which was, at the moment when production companies started multiplying, and web design and film production and all of these things that were allowed and facilitated through these kind of new digital mediums. And so in that context, I became an artist. And what artists did at that time, I moved out of North London and I moved to East London, where, like a lot of other artists did at that time, and East London is now filled with almost nothing but artists. And there I began to see the kind of difficult relationship that the art world had with culture, and particularly urban culture, in that, as the artists would move into kind of poor immigrant neighborhoods, and they would take over. And so what I started to see was that one culture, or to a certain extent, cultural diversity, became replaced with another type of culture, which was this art culture. And so in my experience in East London, I started to realize that artists in the art world was responsible for what we now call gentrification. And I started to also see that I was part of this process. And So this is a story about when I feature lots of little kind of anecdotes of my own personal experience in order to kind of talk about these bigger issues in a kind of small, anecdotal and hopefully humorous way. So here I talk about having a brain hemorrhage in a Bikram yoga class. And even though this is I tell the story not just for shock value, but also to talk about, to a certain extent, what cultural appropriation's most devastating consequences can be. And, the dangers of kind of brutally mixing together global cultures and different cultures for, commercial ends, basically. After my experience in London, I ended up in China, in a city called Guangzhou, which is the production capital of China. So it has 80,000 factories and is connected with Shenzhen and Hong Kong as a kind of urban area of 120 million people. And this is basically the workshop of the world. So at that time, it was where 80% of our clothes and furniture was coming from. And as a result, it was filled with traders from all over the world. And so there was this very kind of new type of cosmopolitanism, and it was based on people coming together for financial purposes for the sake of the kind of global market economy, which had just really taken hold and come to reign. And at the same time, what was interesting about this city was that it is formerly Canton, and it was also the site of a kind of very ancient form of multiculturalism when there was a huge communication between, even before European colonialism, between China and Africa and the Middle East. And what was interesting is that I started to see that this new kind of mixing together of cultures, which was seemed to be happening in China for the first time, was actually the reintroduction of old relationships and historic relationships that taught me for the first time about a totally ancient type of globalization that had nothing to do with Europe or the West, and in fact was disrupted by Europe and the West. In this book, I'm an outside observer of architecture. So I'm not trained in architecture, but I'm a lover of it. So I tried my best to also create a survey of architectural masterpieces like these. And what I loved about China was the amount of humor and the amount of playfulness that was kind of incorporated into every design. Let me see. Oops. And Guangzhou was the first city that I lived in where kind of fantasies were being played out in a scale in a way that I hadn't seen before in London. And at the same time, what was interesting was that within this very modern and new context, these ancient ways of life were still embedded. So this is Guangzhou. It's heavily polluted because of the factories. And I lived in a glass tower called, in an apartment complex called City 21 Millennium, which was kind of named to celebrate a kind of a futurism that existed in Guangzhou. And this is the view from my window. So you can see the kind of divisions between rich and poor. So basically the new middle class were living in these gated communities in these glass towers. And directly outside of my gates were these old style hutongs where you know, the poor, the poor and factory workers, and the Guangzhouian, the native Guangzhouians lived. This is my house. So in fact, you know, the expats in Guangzhou, particularly the Western expats, lived in a very obscene and surreal kind of conditions, in a way removed from the rest of the culture. And I started to be, but at the same time, very instrumental and very involved, and also part of a very quickly changing and shifting social and cultural environment. So this is an example of how the old and the new were layered on top of each other. Guangzhou is filled with traders from all over the world who were there to basically supply the world with goods. And these were mainly men who were in China for a very short space of time. They had to navigate many different cultures, and yet it was a kind of cosmopolitanism that they had, which had nothing to do with interest or love or appreciation for cultures. And so the way that they survived, there was also a huge African population here. So it was the biggest African population in the whole of Asia here in Guangzhou. Oh, hang on 1 second. What is it? Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I knew there was an 8-year-old crying fit. Inevitably going to happen.
All right.
So I'm glad we got that out of the way. Okay, sorry about that. So anyway, so I became really interested in the kind of lives of these traders, because I realized that the global market economy really depended on them. So, and we depended on them. Everyone, everywhere now depends on them. And yet they are kind of relegated to these the margins of, in a way, the globe. And the way that they existed, particularly in China, was by recreating their home cultures in very small bubbles, as it seemed. So in Guangzhou, there was a kind of African town that was an African area that was called Chocolate City. There was an area, a whole island that was dedicated to Americans who were adopting Chinese children. And so all of the expat communities or immigrant communities or very temporary visitors, like the traders that would come just for a few days, they existed in the alien culture of China by recreating their homes in these small territories. And so I became really interested in these recreations and these appropriations, because they were really like portals to me from one place to another. And so I started to photograph these portals. So the instances where in one part of the world, another part of the world exists in a kind of micro recreated form. And so I also went to the Chinese communities in England. So this is a Chinese restaurant outside, right next to the nuclear reactor in Scunthorpe. And so I was really interested in these crossovers, basically, where one place would meet another, and how people were able to function and live. I also talk a lot about my way, what my personal experience was. So how I was dependent on assistants and translators for basically everything, the kind of emotional relationships that I built up with them, and the people who were helping me basically survive, and the kind of intensity that created. I also talk about my ways of surviving financially. So I started a magazine, and I was working on curating exhibitions and having exhibitions, but there wasn't a lot of money in the art world. So at one point, my assistant said to me, well, why don't you become a DJ? Because, a white DJ will make a lot of money. So I became a DJ for 2 weekends, where actually opening up the biggest nightclub in the Dongwon factory district. So that was a kind of immediate, this is the poster. I turned up to the club and my face was splattered over the entire building, which was extremely intimidating. But again, I talk about how globalization is really these multiple layers of appropriation and copying. So I talk about appropriation. In the previous chapters, I talk about the difficulty of appropriation and the way that appropriation means that, this mainstream, to a certain extent, how native cultures have been robbed, and this is the cultural appropriation debate that we have very often, is how there's a kind of robbery as the market economy kind of sucks up the inventions of others and native people. And at the same time, what's interesting about it, I have an enthusiasm for it, because I see that at the same time, new things are invented by all these strange layers of cultural appropriation. And for me, what was interesting was going back into the raves, and see how rave culture had been invented and interpreted in China 20 years after I was going to the raves in London, in the warehouse in London. So, yeah. Within this city in Guangzhou, there is a huge amount of illegality and a very strong black market and grey market. You can call these numbers and you can get basically anything that you want, whether it's fake jeans, fake passports, Pradas, or even if you want to hire a hitman. And I also was very inspired by the freedom that this illegality created and the inventiveness that was allowed. And in contrast to the very heavily regulated market that I had grown up in London. This is an urban village, which is a part of the city that it's where farms were eventually enclosed by city, and it was a few parcels of land which were owned by farmers rather than the state. So it was places where people were able to build and develop without any rules. So the buildings became really close, started to touch each other. And these parts of the city were really amazing to me, because in the West, I'd always been told that China was a place which was intensely regulated, where there was a lot of government control. So it was amazing for me, and maybe it was totally naive of me to see how much was unregulated and how there were these pockets of total freedom that I didn't expect. At the same time, there were a lot of really absurd situations where people were in this kind of enthusiasm for development and this extreme development, you could call it. Buildings were built that were never intended to be finished, but would be sold off to would-be middle-class Chinese urbanites. But they would never finish the building, and people would lose their life savings these ways. So, of course, there was a huge amount of this type of corruption happening too. But basically, in the time that I was there, I saw the city being totally reinvented, and it was amazing to see the speed at which this could and would happen. But also to see how totally confusing this was for people who had been there, for the real inhabitants. Here I talk about the influence of hip hop again. I'm tracing the way in which Western musical forms that maybe weren't, that were already appropriations of non-Western musical forms, then became appropriated again in different parts of the world. And hip hop, there was a lot of rappers, a lot of hip hop clubs in Guangzhou. And it was really interesting because in these spaces, there was a completely new or a new kind of global racial relationships that were being built. So it was a way in which rap stars and Black men were icons and idols, and represented wealth and entrepreneurship. And so there was a kind of, it was interesting to be in a place or to see the way in which race relations were being reformed or formed outside of the problematic relationships that had been installed by the West, say. Most Valuable Player was a hip hop club that I would go to that was frequented by African traders. And as I said, there was a huge African community in China. What times, how long have I got till the Glen?
Yeah, we're just at past just now, so.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to start skipping through. This is the African market in China. This is, where the trade, a huge amount of products from a huge amount of the products in Africa are made in China. So this relationship is extremely important for the global market economy, and indeed for Africa, and indeed for China. This is an African church. It was in the old Russian, it was in the Russian district. It was a French Gothic church in the old Russian colonial part of Guangzhou that was now taken over by Nigerian clergy, and was actually touristed by Chinese people who would come to take selfies with African men. So I'm also really interested in these moments of overlap where different cultures kind of meet, and I'm interested in what these meetings say for the global world order, I guess you could say. I also go then, when I went to Lagos, I suddenly started to see the inverse of the relationship that I had noticed before in China. So here I went to the Chinatowns in Lagos. But again, it was a confirmation of how important this relationship with China was. And of course, everywhere I went, having been in the city that had produced all of these goods, I suddenly saw how they had flowed through the world. So that the markets, these markets ultimately are filled with Chinese goods. And also, of course, what I saw in Lagos was what the consequence is of all of this intense production, and the problems of what are we going to do with the waste. So again, it was interesting being in Lagos, because it was another place where the future was very much ahead of them. And it was like China had this optimism about what was to come that was kind of outside of maybe what was actually there at the time. I'm going to skip through. What was interesting again was seeing how these kind of architectures of luxury appeared everywhere in a very similar form. So in terms of the kind of designs and the styles, I try to create record to show where things are the same, and also the way in which the same things are different every time they are in a different place, if that makes sense. We see that everywhere in the world, gold buildings are replacing other maybe more beautiful or what we now think are more beautiful buildings. And of course, it was interesting because Guangzhou, and indeed particularly Shenzhen, which is a city that it neighbors Guangzhou, was the home, I think, of the most gold buildings of anywhere in the world. Again, we saw the importance of the art world, which was kind of showing up everywhere, but at the same time had a different kind of meaning. So basically, where I saw in London, the art world had really been a tool, or the way in which gentrification was implemented in European cities and in American cities like New York, how in other parts of the world, it had, of course, a different meaning, which was it was a way that voices that hadn't sort of had a space were able to express themselves. When I went to Nigeria, one of the things that became very clear was the connection in terms of architecture between England and Nigeria. So there was some of these buildings really reminded me of the brutalist buildings of that I lived with in London, or lived around in London. And that was, of course, the connection that colonialism had installed, but that also continued into the 60s and 70s. So what was interesting was, or what I started to see was that no matter where you are in the world, everything starts to seem a patchwork of different places, or places that remind you of somewhere you've already been. And that's maybe this sort of traveling, and it's probably also designed by some of the same architects. And yet this is, of course, a very Africanized version of brutalism. There was a connection between Dubai and Nigeria. For the same reason that there was a connection between Nigeria and China, Dubai was the other city which which collected together a huge amount of traders from around the world who didn't want to go to China because it was too far or maybe too difficult. So Dubai was where a lot of products from China would travel to and would there be sold to traders from other parts of the world. And so when I came to Dubai, I started to see the real connections between these different cities. I was asked to photograph Dubai for an exhibition in 2006. I started photographing it 2006, which was at the peak of its kind of explosion of its meteoric rise, you could call it. So I think by 2007, 95% of everyone living in Dubai was an expat. So the Emirati population was only 5%. And again, it was people had come here for the sole purpose of making money and were not attempting to integrate or even to stay. And so I saw the same thing happening, that people were recreating their homes in these alien territories as a way of surviving and living, comfortably, or in a way that made them feel at home. This is City Lust. It's a Chinese-made ripoff of Sex in the City perfume. And it was being sold in a wholesale market in Dubai for traders from Africa, traders from Eastern Europe, traders from everywhere in the world. So again, I called the book City Lust because firstly, it was such a nice name to, I found it such a nice name. And it was but also it kind of represented these different layers, or the way in which all 5 of the places in the book came together in this one simple, cheap product. So it represented the connections between all 5 places to me. This was interesting. This was the way in which basically it also said how much Western ideology was, or Western values was kind of exported and promoted around the world. This is Dubai Creek, which is these are the ships that bring products from China to other parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world. These are the many products that you could buy in these markets of Dubai. Again, this is the presence of the art world. And of course, tourism. And this was one of the only cities that I went to where tourism was one of the main ways of making money. And it created these very interesting, strained relationships between different races and different cultures. And of course, an incredibly strict kind of hierarchy between them. And also which allowed people to live totally different types of lives within the same city. So I went from these hotels where people lived at the kind of utmost luxury to the labor camps, which were, this again shows how differently how different values can exist in the same city. These were the labor camps where the migrant workers lived. So again, what was interesting was that basically these different conditions lived side by side, basically sometimes separated just by one single wall. And, it was a kind of living together and then existing again with a kind of much more ancient Emirati culture, and then an even much more ancient Bedouin culture in the deserts. And so it became a kind of we talk about parallel societies, they call it in Germany, and social segregation. We talk about that as a problem here in Holland and in the UK. But in Dubai, it was actually a solution for how to live together. So in ways, so basically this segregation and this separation was the means by which people could live together. So it was a kind of living together without seeing each other. It was a proximity with an absolute distance. And I am very interested in this as an alternative form of multiculturalism, because it demands basically that people ignore each other rather than understand each other. So where we, particularly in Holland, are constantly talking about assimilation as a way of getting people together, or us dealing with our cultural differences and us dealing with our differences in values. In other parts of the world, it's the exact opposite. Again, what I loved about Dubai was the curviness and the weirdness and the playfulness of its and the tackiness. And that it was basically a kind of fantasy that became real. Again, these are the workers that come mainly from South Asia who actually build the city. So all of these photos that I've shown you happened before 2008. And in 2008, the global market economy crashed and we had the first global recession. And that hugely impacted the cities. And it's where, and it actually started off a kind of anti-globalization or a reversal of the globalization and the coming together and the living together that I had seen. So I'm going to skip through very quickly, just to say that suddenly the euphoric building and development that I'd seen in Dubai. So here on the right is a building site that of a building that during the recession was suddenly abandoned. So Dubai, before, these building sites and these buildings had been a sign of the kind of power and wealth and the growing wealth of the area, were now a sign of the recession and the economic problems, and ultimately of the reversal of what the trends that I had seen. Here is Obama being used as a poster boy for Changyu advertising. And then I moved to Texas. And I'm going to quickly skip through, very quickly through Texas. But again, in Texas too, in Houston, Texas, I also went to the Chinatowns and the Africa towns and looking at at these immigrant communities. That had been, but also looking at the tortured histories of slavery. How people lived in prefab colonial mansions. The rich lived in prefab colonial mansions. Again, and just across the road, you could find people that lived in vast ghettos, in small shacks. And so again, it was this incredible division between rich and poor. And at the same time, it was a kind of segregation, but with an ideology of multiculturalism and togetherness, and the American ideology at the same time was kind of forced on it, or superficially forced onto it. There's a huge interest in religion. There's the cowboys. I talk about my interaction with the police, and how out of all of the places that I'd been to, and in two of which were considered authoritarian regimes, it was only when I got to America that I had found, really experienced the terrifying power and brutality of the state apparatus. Then I returned to Europe. And so ultimately, this is the conclusion of the book, where I look back at what I've learned about, how globalization, and then how I started to see globalization going into reverse. So basically, how both China and Dubai, when the recession happened, started to make it a lot harder for foreigners to come in and live, and how there were new visa restrictions. And basically, the thing that we had thought was happening was that the world was opening up and that we were all joining and becoming one. That was only a temporary moment, and that actually this was going into reverse and has gone into reverse. This is a picture of Dubai. And I always talk about this picture because I show how in Europe, which values itself for its freedom and is actually something like this would be illegal in Holland and it would be illegal in France. So my real question is, what is freedom, and what are the many ways in which we can live together, and what is the future of multiculturalism? And I also talk about the future must have very much to do with, firstly, being clear about what the history of multiculturalism was and showing the way that we have lived together so many times in the past. And that's it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Charlie. That was brilliant. We'll just open up for some questions. So you'll be able to type them into the chat box or type them into the Q&A as well. If you'd like to speak yourself, then maybe put that at the end and I'll be able to unmute you.
Yeah, please speak.
So I think we had a few coming in while we were talking there. So the first one was from Katie Phillips. So she was asking what attracted you to move to Guangzhou. But I mean, maybe I'll expand that a wee bit and say what attracted you to all the different cities?
Well, it was really work, actually. So most of them were from work assignment. So Lagos, I went on an assignment, and Guangzhou, I went on an assignment. And obviously my work as a photographer, I get assigned to go to different places. But the reason I chose these places is for the book, ultimately, is because I saw how connected they were. So they allowed me to show what the kind of workings of the global market economy, or what the global market economy, which is this term that we talk about, and every time you turn on the news, you hear about it. But I wanted to show what it actually looks like. Mm-hmm. And so I used these cities. But I went to China, actually. It was after I had the brain hemorrhage in the yoga class, and I spent a year in a dark room, basically, while my brain rewired. And after that, I went to on holiday to visit my cousin because I just had to get out. It was my first trip abroad. And when I got to, but I having recovered from this near-death experience, I had this total euphoria about the world. And I also, my eyes saw with a kind of new brightness. And when I got to Guangzhou, it was the city and its euphoria, and the fact that there were neon lights and neon rainbows everywhere totally reflected my mood. So I went there for a holiday to visit my cousin, who was a shoe designer, and he was working in a factory there, and he'd been asking me to come over for a long time. And and so I just went there to visit him, and I ended up not leaving. So for 6 years. Wow. So I got but I also got an exhibition there that made me stay. So they were building and making a factory area into an art area, and they were having a triennale there. So I had to show some pictures there, and then I started to see how I could produce images, and also how vital photographs were in that context where, the internet was just allowing people who had found it very hard to travel previously to kind of discover the world. And in that context, it was really exciting being a photographer and an artist.
Yeah, definitely. So Vera had her hand up. I don't know do you want to ask a question, Vera?
Yeah, so I guess we have 2 questions in here because we're 2 people. Yeah. Sorry, you can't see the video, I don't think. But thank you. Firstly, thank you so much. This is super interesting. And our first question is, you're clearly very interested in people and the kind of how people inhabit spaces. And I think we were quite interested in how your background in sociology has informed your approach to photography. I guess that's how, I don't know if that's understandable.
Yeah, of course, definitely. Yes, that was the one question, right? Yeah, okay. And yeah, I think for me, when I left, I studied sociology in New York. And again, I was just interested in New York was a place where all these identities, or it felt like identities were, the whole concept of identity was sort of melting and I studied sociology, but I found that there was so much. Well, my problem with sociology was that it made these very concrete, put people into very concrete typologies and groups. And actually my interest was the way in which kind of groups and typologies were no longer relevant. And I found that the only way to photograph the changing or these typologies in flux, or the exact moment when a typology or group is made and a group is dissolved, it felt like only a photo could really show that, you know, or could best show that, or could easily show that maybe. So for me, I feel like it's just a way of, you know, the photograph is the way, or photographing firstly is the excuse to go out and look at people. So I really found the camera, it's like the ultimate shield, where it's almost like an invisibility cloak, or it allows me to be invisible. So maybe I'm not invisible to the person I'm photographing, but at least I feel invisible because I'm no longer thinking, you know, I disappear. So it was really the excuse to go out and be in places that I don't belong. So I think ultimately that's what the camera does. It gives you an excuse to be somewhere you shouldn't be or you don't need to be. And therefore, and it also, allows me to photograph groups as they're made, or record groups as they're made. But for me, writing, and in my books, I always like to write as well, because I feel there's a lot that photography can't capture, or at least there's a photograph somehow always needs to be explained. And people want to know where it is or what it is of. But the problem with captioning a photograph, and that's the problem I had with the book, it took me 10 years to make the book, because I never knew how to caption it. Because the minute you put a time and a place and a date, people are like, okay, that's what it is, you know. But so I wanted to actually, especially with these photographs, be able to confuse people a little, so they would have to do some work to figure out where they are or what they're seeing. And so I use these stories, these anecdotes, and I hope sometimes humorous or weird anecdotes, to create a kind of necessary mystery. So therefore, my stories are very sociological, but they're also personal. And I think that was a conscious decision to tell a personal story, even though my training as a sociologist had let me know, okay, you should be an observer and a scientist, and you should be neutral. But over the 10 years that I started to make the book, the whole idea of being neutral and of neutrality and objectivity had been dissolved, you know. So I teach post-colonial theory, and I'm very interested in the way that post-colonial theory relates to photography. And so suddenly I realized that a photograph, a book of photographs of a white European taken in other parts of the world was somehow I would have to talk about what my personal perspective was. I couldn't claim neutrality anymore. I would have to talk about the lens I was looking through. So in that sense, yeah, maybe the photography is sociological, and then I scientificize it by I'm not a scientist when I write these personal stories.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We do have another question.
Yeah, I'm also here with Vera, and I have actually two questions. The first of which was like, at what point did you know you were like making a book with this work and like with all these like cities and countries that you had visited? Like, was it a preconceived idea before you like even went to Guangzhou? And also, like, out of the cities that you spoke about in your book, like, which do you feel like broke down your preconceptions, or did you like go to these places with like preconceptions? Because it very much felt like the narrative was like that you spoke through was kind of hinted about that like Eurocentric perception,
Yeah,
being like erased, and like realizing this whole other network of like cities were involved together without Europe, kind of.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, when I went to China, not only that, but I had to undid a lot of my kind of Western education. So, for instance, in China, there's a whole different understanding of history of the world, where the Chinese explorer Zheng He actually discovered America 50 years before Christopher Columbus. And this picture in my book here, this is a recreation of Zheng He's ship in Dubai Mall. So this is actually a kind of celebration of the anti-Western history of the world, but it's surrounded by Starbucks and H&Ms and Western brands, So that's why I love this picture. Is exactly that, about the kind of breaking down of the Western stories about the world that I'd inevitably been indoctrinated with. And to a certain extent, much of the world is indoctrinated with just because of the presence of the Western media. And I found that things that I had truly believed were neutral. So, for instance, the BBC News, maybe not. When I lived in China and I would come back to. Or when I lived in China, in Guangzhou, and I saw this incredible relationship between the Africans living in Guangzhou, or the incredibly important relationship of the Africans living in Guangzhou, and how the Africans were in Guangzhou considered. So I show this picture. I show one picture where there's an African beggar. I don't know if you remember it, but he's begging to a African man who's dressed in gold. So that was outside the African church. But anyway, in that was outside the African church in Guangzhou. But I did a lot of interviews with the African traders. I made a magazine actually, which was filled with only interviews of foreigners. When I first got to Guangzhou, I made a magazine. So I never intended to make a book. The book definitely came later, and it was the way of the book ended up being this kind of the thesis of, my and the record of my experience. But these were all exhibitions separately or assignments separately. And in Guangzhou, I just started to photograph when I was living there. But I also had, when I got there, was asked to do magazine articles about Guangzhou because there was this interest in China. But anyway, back to the relationship between China and Africa. I remember when I would travel back to England, and I would watch the news, and I remember there was a moment when there was a lot of stories on the news about the exploitation of Africa by the Chinese. And they was talking about this new colonialism of Africa by the Chinese. But the stories were totally different from what I was hearing from the Africans in China, who were talking about the Chinese actually coming into Africa with 5-year plans and 5-year contracts, and that they were very different from the relationships, and that they were much more long-term and embedded than the relationships that, or the deals that the Western businesses would come into Africa with. And so basically what I was hearing on the news was completely in such stark contrast to what I was experiencing and seeing in China. And so it started to let me know that these supposed neutral news organizations like the BBC and CNN, and it's horrible to rubbish them now after Trump called them the fake news media. So I don't want to go down that road, but it basically started to see that this anti-Chinese sentiment and this skepticism about China was, of course, politically motivated ultimately, and it was out of fear of losing our dominance.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Cool.
I'll move on to a question that we had coming from Elena. So she was asking, sort of along the same link of you forming your book. So how did you find collating the photographs and journeys into a book? Was it a difficult process, or was it exciting to map out your experiences?
It was a nightmare, to be honest. That was like getting blood out of a stone. But I think I made something like 300 versions of this book.
Okay.
I mean, at some point I made a different version of the book every single day. And so I had like tens of thousands of photographs. And I started making a book in 2006, or little versions. So I made, firstly, whenever I photograph anything, I always make a book out of my photographs. So when I make an exhibition, I always start with making a book, just as the book as the ultimate record of my, it's always important to see the book, my photographs in print to understand them. And so I started making books of my photographs separately. So I made Lagos books, I made a Dubai book, I made a Dubai book with 500 images, which was for an exhibition in Dubai, in Vitra Design Museum, which actually I made the book. I printed it out in large scale, so it became a 45-meter long book that you could fold. Each page of the book was 1 meter in length, and you could actually leaf through it. So it was over 45 meters. So that was my first book, which became an installation that was a book. And I'm just kind of, obsessed with books. So in my exhibitions, I've always tried to make books. So I sometimes paste words and text and posters and paper around entire spaces so that you can almost feel like you're walking through a book. And I've made this book as an exhibition and installations that you can walk into. But anyway, in 2008, I had my first exhibition where I had these different cities. So it was before I lived in Houston. So it was only 4 of the cities, and I had to put them together in an exhibition. And for that, I created a catalog. And that was the beginning of this book. And so that was the beginning of trying to kind of explain what the connections between these cities were, and what they said more broadly about the changing nature of kind of the politics of the world. And then I had for a while, and I had another publisher that I nearly made the book with in 2011. And at that time, I made the book where I didn't put chapters. I didn't put any captions as to where the city was. And on each page, I put a different city, but I combined it with a kind of style or a theme, or, so I showed a similar architecture, but from 2 different places. And the idea was to show you these 5 cities, but completely not let you know where you are. So you start to see that our differences, and the differences between places is a fabrication, or but anyway, but eventually, but for that, I didn't put any text. And that was at the moment in 2009, when I still really believed that we had to be neutral as photographers. And I took a kind of sociological approach. But then in the meantime, as I said, I started to realize that somehow I had to talk about my perspective. And I also started to see that what I'd really learned, or what was the real experience, even though I was photographing these other places, what I was learning was about what it meant to be a Westerner, and the way in which the West had impacted the world. And so I saw myself reflected back at me in these cities, and so somehow it became interesting, and I thought it was interesting or important to talk about that reflection and talk about that experience, and again, talk about the lens through which I was seeing. So suddenly it felt dishonest and calculated, and maybe, maybe almost, almost corrupt to not talk about who was taking the picture, and what my perspective was, and what my history and my background and all these things. So then came the story, but that was, of course, a nightmare, another nightmare. So after I'd spent 6 years playing with images, and photographs are amazing, because the minute you put 2 photographs together, they start talking to each other, and they start having they start having a conversation, and all these connections happen. And I remember once I made a book, and I spent like months really working on really thinking about every single composition and every image and how they went together. But then when it was printed, it was mixed up so that one page was wrong. So actually each image was put together with the image from the previous spread, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And actually and I realized at that moment that it became so much better when the printing was wrong, because suddenly new accidental connections emerge, and they were just as strong. So at the same time as I spent 6 years trying to figure out what the connections and what the best image was with every single image, I also realized that, if you put them together randomly, the connections would probably just as strong, and they would start speaking to each other. But anyway, so I did that for 6 years, and then for another 4 years, I attempted to write the story. And that was just very difficult, because I was describing basically my entire life. And at the same time, I wasn't trying to write about me. I understood that it wasn't me that was interesting. So I wasn't trying to go into, every experience. I was just trying to pick out which experience gives you, in a kind of anecdotal form, tells you something bigger about what I'm trying to say. So I was trying to take, complex political issues and theoretical issues and translate them into funny, personal, like anecdotes, So, but it wasn't about telling the story of my life. I was only trying to pick out the stories of my life that were relevant to explaining the pictures. And so that was difficult, because first I had to tell the entire story. So I think I wrote over 90,000 words, but in the end, the text is 20,000 words. So, I spent like 2 years just taking words out. So, yeah, so hopefully in the book, you see that kind of effort.
Yeah, definitely. I'd probably say that the anecdotes would help to understand the city in a larger context as well. If you're giving your personal experience, it helps the reader to understand what's going on in the wider context. Another question we've had come in. So, in your experience, is there any underlying social and cultural threads that tie the countries together? I mean, personally, like to add on to that about music. How you mentioned that at the beginning. How did sort of music link that?
But wait, could you say the question? I didn't hear you totally correctly.
In your experience, is there any underlying social and cultural threads that tie the countries together?
Well, in a way, there was 2 threads, or maybe even 3 threads that I followed because they, again, were personal to me and I understood them. So one was the global market economy connects them. So in a way, it was the way, you could see the connection between China and Nigeria and Dubai just through the goods, so we could see the city lost perfume, for instance, would show up or can show up in any single in a market in any single one of these cities. So really the thing that really connects these cities are the products, and the products represent the economy. So and by living in Guangzhou and by going to Dubai, going to Lagos, which is a hub, also a port, so all of the cities that I'm talking about started their lives as ports, actually, so that's what connects them. Yeah. And it's because of these, they're the ports they're the hubs on the different continents through which all of the products flow. So all of the products made in China traveling through the world flow through Guangzhou. Nearly all of the products coming from China and the rest of the world that go and get disseminated through the rest of Africa flow through Nigeria and Lagos. And it's the same with Dubai for the Middle East. So that's essentially how they were connected, through the kind of traveling, the movement of products and objects. And therefore also you could see the global market economy in action, in its most kind of mundane and everyday incarnation. And at the same time, these cities were, of course, connected through their histories. So, Guangzhou had, in the 17th century, it already had African traders and an African community, and it was historically connected through China's, again, through the kind of first globalization that China had, or the first time China already had kind of its global dominance, and Chinese products already traveled through the world. But then one of the things I was really interested in is global culture. So I know that I was part of a generation that invented global culture or experienced global culture for the first time. And I'm an appreciator of global culture. And yet at the same time, I also really wanted to look at what is global culture, like what exactly that. Like, we are united in some way. So, and you only have to look at TikTok to see that there is a global culture. So, in almost every, one dance craze will, travel to every single part of the world. So the context becomes different, but the interests are the same. And so we now probably have a situation that someone from 15 years old who, as long as they are connected to the internet and they have a mobile phone, they could get together and share, clips and things, and they would have kind of the same interests, the same obsessions, and maybe the same hobbies. So in that sense, that where there is a global culture, and at the same time, though, these global trends, and so I took rave, which is a music, but also is a fashion, is also as a lifestyle, or as a style, And the same as hip hop. Hip hop is a music, but it's also a culture. It's also a fashion. It's also, to a certain extent, a philosophy. And it's an art form, or many different art forms. And you could say also hip hop culture or urban culture in general, like skating and graffiti. You know, you can go to like almost any big city in the world and you will see graffiti. You know, you can find a rap group and who makes music roughly with the similar themes. And at the same time, these global cultures are interesting because if you look at them, you also find that they're appropriated, but in totally unique ways. So I had this, I found this hip hop, this video on YouTube, and it was a hip hop video. I think it was KRS-One who narrates it. And he talks about how hip hop went global, and then he shows, you know, a rapper in Korea, a rapper in India, a rapper in Brazil, you know, and they're usually standing with these graffiti backgrounds, you know, but not only do you see how similar we are, but in these incarnations, these different incarnations, you also see our differences and you see what's unique. So you see that this cultural appropriation, so global culture is a kind of culture that can be easily appropriated. And in turn, it has been appropriated. It stems from a series of appropriations, but it can be appropriated everywhere. And then you sort of see that it's appropriate, but in totally unique form. And so my theory is that is where authenticity happened. And my book really wanted to be an argument against this idea that globalization is causing kind of the homogenization, you know, because even in the gold buildings in China or the gold buildings in Africa, they're the same, but still, you know, different and totally unique. And if you put them all together, you see not so much even how we're the same, but you see the differences become even more pronounced. And so my theory is really it's in those kind of appropriations of global culture where new culture is being invented, or it's actually incredibly authentic, even though it's based on copying. But I'm interested in this kind of copy paste mechanism of production. And that's why I talk about rave and hip hop, because those were the first art forms that were made from sampling and made from copy paste, you know? So to a certain extent, you could almost say that what is similar is that we are all copy and pasting, and that cultural production is based on copying and pasting. Yeah.
Going on from that, where would you see globalization going now, or do you feel like it's potentially retracting?
Well, I saw it retracting, and it was funny. I saw it retracting because I saw, you know, it harder. You know, also with the Olympic Games in China, I started to see that, you know, Africans. You could walk through the center of Guangzhou, and it would seem like an African city, but then. When I went back in 2015, it was after the recession, and there was a kind of tightening of visa restrictions and an increased regulation. And actually, it was a Chinese city again. So this moment where it was a sort of like this global city was already past. And therefore, that was also another thing, because I was making my book, but the whole thing the meaning of every picture kept changing as a situation. So the book never finished, because the story kept writing itself, and it kept being a new story, and every image meant something different one year to the next. But finally, I finished it just before Corona, and then Corona happened. And suddenly I realized that the book was this historic document of a situation that could never exist anymore. So I saw that these black markets, and, you know, we suddenly now exist in a world where dirt has been eliminated and a density is illegal. And all of these conditions that I had photographed were no longer able to exist. And now we're not allowed to travel at all. So in a way, the historic value of this book became, totally pronounced because of Corona. So I wonder if you could even ever sort of see people with that kind of density, or see people in China living side by side with animals. All of these issues all of these things, these life conditions became politicized and basically, illegal.
Yeah. That's perfect. I'm sure we could sit here and talk all day, but I think we're going to have to finish up now because it's getting on a bit. But thank you so much for coming out again today. It was really interesting to hear about your book, and it's so interesting to hear about your experiences. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who are keen to buy your book and have a read into it now.
Yeah, please do, yeah. And text me, message me any comments you have.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks again, everyone, for turning up. It's another successful lecture.